Anne Applebaum, welcome to Deutsche Welle Trendy program.
Thanks for having me.
First question is about something that happened pretty recently. Senator Lindsey Graham said that he played golf with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump told him, allegedly, that it's time to impose these mega sanctions that are waiting in the Senate on Russia. Do you think that something really shifted in Washington?
So I can't predict how Donald Trump will behave or react in any given moment because he isn't someone who has a strategy. He doesn't think geopolitically, he doesn't think strategically. He makes decisions on the spur of the moment depending on who he's speaking to and whether he perceives himself to be winning. It's true that the Senate, Graham, and more than, as I understand it, 80 other senators are willing to sign a bill that would increase sanctions pretty dramatically. And it's true that some people around Donald Trump want him to do this, but he has other forces and other interests around him too. There are people around him who want him to do a deal with Putin because it might be personally, financially beneficial to themselves or maybe to the president. There are people in the MAGA movement who are actively pro-Russian, and so we'll just have to see who wins the argument.
You seriously think that Donald Trump could sign some kind of deal with Vladimir Putin, which will be also personally beneficial to him, in which way? Money? Or?
Well, we know such things have been proposed, or we're rumored that such things have been proposed. But of course, no, I don't know whether he would do that or not.
Why Trump is so patient with Putin? He knows him since quite a long time. He was president already and he dealt with him. Why is he so gentle with Putin until now? What's your explanation?
People have been asking this question for a decade. Right. There was a major investigation during Trump's first presidency into the sources of Russian influence on the Trump campaign, and it wasn't inconclusive. It showed that there was influence, but they were never able to prove that Trump was criminally involved or that there was a criminal involvement. We know that Trump has had Russian connections for more than 30 years. He's had Russian investment into his business. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is all documented. We know that he has had positive thoughts about Russia. We know he's felt very negative about U.S. alliances for a long time. It's in his books from more than a decade ago. It's in the 1980s, he took out big newspaper advertisements arguing that the U.S. was wasting money on alliances. So all these instincts have been in place even before Putin came to power. So, since he's in power, Trump is someone who's very impressed by people who operate without checks and balances, without restrictions, without courts, without journalists. He admires that kind of power. So my guess is that he's positively disposed to the Russians anyway, and that he's personally impressed with Putin. I don't know, obviously, what their personal interactions are like, but Putin is a trained KGB officer. He would know how to find somebody's weaknesses and he would know how to find the way to manipulate someone and persuade them that he's his friend. Certainly it's the case that Trump believes Putin to be his friend, and he has said that, he's used that word.
Isn't it just a way of telling his own audience that he controls everything? Can he seriously believe that Putin be his friend?
I think he seriously believes that. He doesn't use that word about other people. I mean, he doesn't use it about other leaders, but he does use it about Putin.
Your guess, what will happen if Trump realizes, or if Putin behaves in such a way that Trump will have to realize there's going to be no deal on Ukraine, on whatever, with Putin? What's going to be the consequence?
Well, we are at that moment now. The Russians have never said that they want a deal. They have never said they want a ceasefire. They have never said that if we give them Crimea, they will stop the war, which is the idea that many think tank writers and journalists and statesmen seem to believe. They've never accepted that as a possible ending to the war. That not only have they not stopped fighting since Trump came to office, recently the Russians have actually increased their attacks, especially on civilians, on cities, on civilian infrastructure, on Kiev, on Dnipro, on Kharkiv. So they show absolutely no signs whatsoever of wanting to end the war. And Trump, I mean, this has been obvious for many days. Trump has still not reacted. So you tell me. I mean, I don't know what will he do if the Russians don't begin to end the war. He's doing what he's doing now, and he's doing nothing.
It's interesting that many people were saying that Trump does not have empathy, that it's not part of his psyche, of his character. And then we see him speaking to a Ukrainian journalist during a press conference in The Hague after the NATO summit, and suddenly he seems quite warm and disposed and empathetic. Do you think that maybe something moved him psychologically recently?
I could not have any way of answering that. He clearly has no empathy for many people. He speaks of his opponents as vermin. He talks about immigrants in the United States as poisoning the blood of the nation, this is the language that Hitler used. So he's somebody who is very immune to cruelty and not bothered by civilian casualties. So I doubt very much that one incident has changed him, but who knows?
Putin. There are debates about, especially in this sort of Russia watchers community in it, what are Putin's ultimate goals in Ukraine? How do you see them? Is it conquering the whole Ukraine? Is it putting a puppet government in Kiev and having it as a protectorate, essentially? Is it destroying NATO? Is it all three? How do you see his strategy?
So I think Putin has three goals in Ukraine.
And he has strategy, as opposed to Trump.
Putin absolutely has a strategy. So he has three goals. They overlap a little bit. Number one is an imperial goal. He would like to resurrect the Russian Empire, with himself as the leader of it. This will be his role in history. And towards that end, he would like to see Ukraine, whether it's a puppet government or whether it's fully part of Russia, I don't know, but he would like to erase Ukrainianness. He would like Ukraine to cease to exist as a nation. And he would like Ukraine to be one way or another incorporated back into the Russian Empire. And as I say, in what format that is, I don't know that it really matters. His original goal, as we know, was to conquer Kiev in 3 days and take the rest of the country in 6 weeks. And that was the plan. That plan has failed. So now we're on plan B, which is to undermine and destroy the country as much as possible. So that's his first goal. His second goal is to destroy the set of ideas that propelled the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014. So this was when he saw the Maidan of that year. This was people waving EU flags and carrying slogans against corruption and calling for the end of an autocratic president who was pulling Ukraine in the direction of Russia. When that revolution succeeded, and in other words, when the President Yanukovych fled the country, this for Putin was a kind of alarm bell, because this, of course, is the kind of revolution that he is most afraid of. You know, it's the kind of revolution you almost had in 2010 or 2011. The language of anti-corruption is the language that Alexei Navalny used. This language of not just of democracy, but rule of law, transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, this is the language that's most damaging and dangerous to him. And he sees Ukraine, the need to destroy Ukraine is also partly about destroying that language and the appeal of that language in Russia. So it's also in his idea, it's a kind of war of ideas. The third element of it is global. I mean, Putin does have a geopolitical strategy, and his strategy is to undermine the international law and rules of the world as they were established after the Second World War. So, UN Charter.
Not even after the Cold War, after the Second
World War.
Mm-hmm.
No, the UN Charter which guarantees sovereignty of nations, in their borders. Geneva Conventions on warfare. Warfare is not supposed to be aimed at civilians. UN Convention on Genocide, which means that you're not meant to cease to destroy or undermine the existence of a nation. All these things he would like to show that they don't count for anything, they don't mean anything. He can destroy them and undermine them with impunity, and he can get away with it. And that's, of course, he sometimes speaks, I mean, it's a little bit vague, but he talks about the multipolar world that he wants to live in. Multipolar is either a word that means nothing, really. I mean, clearly a multipolar world where there are many powers, obviously that's what we have. But I think he means something different. He means a world in which might makes right, and in which strong countries can invade weaker ones, and big countries can dominate smaller ones. And that this is the world he would like to inhabit, not one where these rules and UN and US and other things stand in his way. So these, I think, are his goals. I mean, personal, political, but also global.
Isn't it a paradox? Because in a multipolar world, Russia will not be the strongest pole if you compare it to, let's say, China.
Or India.
Or the United States. So why do you want it?
Well, he's building up his military. He's he's creating new areas in which he has power. I mean, the power of the influence campaigns that the Russians run, in which they really they began the idea of a kind of using the internet for global influence to destroy and undermine and divide their neighbors. I think he imagines that he'll have a big role, especially if he can conquer Ukraine and take Ukraine's resources.
Which campaign, in your view, of these influence campaigns, or many, of course, which was the most successful for the Kremlin?
It's hard for, there are no precise measurements. I mean, I think, the campaign to build up and help create the AfD in Germany, this is very successful, given that it, what large support it now has. But there have been Russian attempts to influence elections in Britain, in France, the Brexit campaign in the UK. I don't give full credit to the Russians for doing these things. And the Brexit campaign was indigenous, and it was mostly British. And so I don't think the Russians have this decisive role. But they certainly put money and effort and thought into expanding some of these games. And of course, they campaigned to elect Donald Trump in 2016.
All these influence campaigns, whether it concerns the right or the left, because also there.
So of course they have some far left.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it came the time when Russia, or whatever, external players, let's put it like that, can successfully help these political forces that wouldn't have happened probably 15 years ago? So what happened over the last 15, 20 years which now helps the Kremlin to help these forces?
The most important thing that happened is the shift of political conversation from real life to the online world. And also the correspondent shift of Western not just Western politics, but democratic politics everywhere, from arguments about policy to arguments about identity. And the fact that we now have a global information space meant that it was suddenly much easier for anybody to intervene anywhere, actually. Obviously, going back to the history of the Soviet Union, the Soviet propagandists ran campaigns in Western democracies all the time. I mean, starting from the 1920s. But the internet gives them the possibility of reaching people in ways that wasn't possible before. I mean, and if you think about it, that's the element that ties all these places together. I mean, so I lived part of the time in Poland, and I lived part of the time in the United States. These are countries that have absolutely nothing to do with one another. They're not similar in demographics. They're not similar in economics. They're not similar in history, in anything. And yet it is really remarkable how similar the political language is and can be in both places. And I think that's a phenomenon not of real life, but of the fact that that politics are conducted on the internet in similar ways in both places.
Don't you think that the success of such campaigns now in the world is also, you say that it's a globalized world, but also that it is a globalized consumer world, because the Soviets could run whatever campaign they wanted to, whichever campaign they wanted to, but if you don't have milk on the shelves and you have to wait for 5 years to buy a car, then there's not much you can sell. Now everyone is a consumer, and that maybe helps because there are elements to Hungary and to the United States and to Brazil and whatever. Russia for that.
Maybe, but I think it's the way that language is used and can affect people online that's really the thing that's the same. You know, there's also a big difference between the past and the present. In the Soviet era, the Soviet Union was promoting something, you know, their vision of the world, their idea of the great communist future, and we could compare what they said to the reality. You know, so there was clearly a gap between who they said they were and what they were really doing. Actually, Putin doesn't really promote his model. You know, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about how great Russia is and how, I don't know, Lithuania and Spain should be like Russia, and nobody really thinks that. It's an entirely negative form of propaganda. It's about promoting cynicism, promoting nihilism, promoting apathy, persuading people to dislike their so-called establishment, to dislike their political systems. It's a negative campaign rather than a positive one, and that turns out to be a little harder to fight.
Do you think Putin personally realizes it after living so many years in isolation? By the way, there's this idea that Putin was won in 2000, let's say 1 or 2 or 3, and then he became different after the Munich speech. So what do you think? Did he change, or is he what he always was?
So to be clear, I never thought he was a great reformer or a great friend, and and particularly was bothered from the very beginning by the language he used about himself. He talked about himself as a Chekist. One of the first things he did when he took over the FSB was put up a portrait of Yuri Andropov, who was famous, for those of your listeners who don't know, was famous for his repression of dissidents in the 1980s. And so I never had much hope that he was some kind of Democrat. I do think he may have changed strategies. I mean, obviously in the early 2000s, he found it useful to be friendly with the West. He wanted Russia to be part of the G7, and briefly it was the G8. And he sought some kind of accommodation or joint projects anyway with American and European leaders. But was he always a Russian imperialist? Yes, of course he was. We know that from the story of the speech in the early 1990s, the story of the president of Estonia who gave a speech at a dinner in Hamburg, and who talked about how happy he was that Estonia was once again part of the Western world. But he was very worried this is 1994, he was very worried about the signs of a resurgent Russian imperialism that might destroy this wonderful new Europe. And the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, who was then Vladimir Putin, famously got up and walked out of the room. So this is going back many decades. So he is somebody who has had Russian imperial ambitions at least that long. He's had criminal connections from the 90s. So he's somebody whose cynicism and greed have dominated everything that he's done from the very beginning. You're right. Many people chose not to see that. They chose to imagine that he was somebody we can do business with. And he did, as I say, he changed his tactics. But he was always the same person, I think.
I think one of the mistakes also was that many people thought that because Putin and his entourage, the Russian elite, for lack of a better word, became so rich, because of that, they will not promote some kind of foreign military adventures because they want to remain rich. So such regimes always also care about perpetuation, on permanency. How does that square with the war which significantly isolated Russia? Or they think that they will manage to transcend, they will be patient and they will win in the end?
I don't have a full answer to why the Russian elite has gone along with a war that has been so damaging, both for themselves personally, but also for their country, or why they have allowed 1 million Russians to be killed or wounded, or why they've allowed their country's wealth to be undermined. I don't have a full explanation for it. It's clearly some combination of fear and reluctance to defy Putin, and perhaps nationalism. I mean, maybe they go along with some part of this vision of the reborn Russian Empire. That would be my only guess.
What, in your view, the West doesn't understand about Putin's Russia and the way it's ruled, and about its rulers? And what does Putin, in your view, does not understand about the West?
I think that the West doesn't understand the extremism of Putinism. As I say, they keep imagining that there's a deal to be done, that if we just give Crimea to Russia, then he'll stop fighting. And I don't think they understand that his goals are much broader and more ambitious. And that those goals involve the destruction of the transatlantic alliance and of maybe even of the European Union. So I think they just haven't quite understood how broad those goals are. And therefore they haven't understood the need to, that before there's going to be any end to the war, Putin will have to lose it, or he will at least have to be convinced that it can't be won. And so the path to peace is through convincing Putin that he won't win the war, that it's hopeless. And I don't see right now, and I leave open the possibility of change. People do change their minds, and these are very capricious people and whimsical people. I leave open the possibility of something different happening, but right now the only thing I can see, that if you really, really want peace, then you must arm Ukraine and defend it until Putin realizes the war is over. So I think that's the main thing that Westerners don't understand.
And what does Putin not understand?
So Putin has underestimated from the beginning. He's first of all underestimated the Ukrainians. He knows very little about modern Ukraine. He doesn't know who they are. He didn't understand that the Ukrainian government is a genuine elected government. It has support, and that the Ukrainian national identity is real, and that the Ukrainians will fight back as long as they can. And that includes fighting a guerrilla war if Kiev were to fall. So I think he failed to understand Ukraine. I don't think he's been to Ukraine in many years, and he certainly had no contact with modern Ukrainians. So he's imagining Ukrainians from some Soviet era, some Ukrainian communists he met 30 years ago. He has no idea what is modern Ukraine. I think he also...
Well, he met Yanukovych, Kuchma, and Yushchenko for that.
Sure, but that makes my point. But I also think that he doesn't, he really underestimated the ability and willingness of Europe and the United States to help Ukraine. And he has underestimated the power of the ideas of, it's not just democracy, it's also about unity and integrity that do motivate at least a part of the West and Western leaders. And he's consistently underestimated them, and he's consistently got things wrong.
Then why, if we look especially at Europe, countries with similar histories of oppression, of Russian and Soviet occupation for that matter, react so differently to Putin's war? I mean, the best examples, of course, are Slovakia and Hungary.
No, they're different. Hungary is very important, because to understand about Hungary, you need to understand that Viktor Orban is leader of a country that is failing economically, that is badly in need of money and investment. And his party is in need of money and investment. And he believes now that he will get it from Russia and China and not from Europe. So Hungary is the decision of one leader who has made this decision to back Russia, and he backs Russia. I mean, it's not very nuanced. Slovakia is a little bit more complicated. I think it's also about money. It's also about Fico's allegiance to Orban. It's about his fear of of Slovak courts and Slovak civil society. And it's less clear to me that he'll stick to some kind of line. But Orban is simply has made a decision to switch sides. By the way, you can see huge protests on the streets of Budapest against him. So it's not that not all Hungarians agree with him.
And what can be done about it externally? You don't expel countries from NATO and the European Union.
I mean, I'm not in charge of NATO and the European Union, but if I were, yeah, I would have found a way to suspend Hungary's voting rights. I mean, Hungary is not an ally anymore. Hungary is not acting in good faith as a member of the EU, and I would have suspended them. But one doesn't want to kick them out because there are other Hungarians, and there's at least more than half the population would like him to go.
What could the West do externally apart from supporting Ukraine all the way and imposing more sanctions? Are there other things which you think other ways of impacting Russia and the Russian regime that are missing?
Well, we've never had an information campaign to Russia directed at Russians. We have sanctions, but we didn't have an information campaign to accompany the sanctions. We didn't explain our sanctions. We have backed Ukraine, and we don't really tell the Russians why we backed Ukraine. Now, the Russians spend millions and millions of dollars, as do other autocratic countries, examining and analyzing and thinking about ways to influence us. And we spend, as far as I know, almost nothing on thinking about ways to influence Russia or reach Russians or speak to Russians or have conversations with Russians.
It's difficult, admittedly, because of VPNs and bans on certain social media and so forth.
Sure, it's difficult, but it wouldn't have to be impossible. On the contrary, when the second Trump administration began, one of the first things they did was to disband the Global Engagement Center, which was a very small program inside the State Department, which merely identified and exposed, in the last few years, it had been identifying and exposing Russian disinformation campaigns, mostly in the Global South, mostly in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere, also in Europe. And yet the Trump administration doesn't even want to do that. So we have made no effort at all to speak to Russians or engage Russians in any way.
Last year in Germany, and I think it was called the Peace Prize of Germany, right? You said that roughly, quoting you, peace does not have to mean pacifism, because pacifism is very frequently a way of appeasing dictators, appeasing aggressors. Do you think that the European moment has come? Do you think that the Europeans, for lack of a better word, saw the light?
I think many did, yes. I mean, I can't speak. It's a very large continent, and there are a lot of people on it, many of whom don't care one way or the other. But certainly the current leadership of Europe, if you look at France, if you look at Germany, if you look at the UK, if you look at Poland, if you look at Scandinavia, if you look at the Baltic states, if you look at the Netherlands, if you look at NATO leadership, even if you look at Italy, if you look at Greece, there is a genuine, I think, understanding of the threat that Russia poses, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe itself. And there is a shift towards thinking differently about defense, both in terms of spending money, but also thinking about what we buy and how we spend the money. We already know this is a very, very different kind of war from any war that anyone has ever fought before. It's a very high-tech drone war, one in which a lot of equipment that people bought for decades, tanks and helicopters, is not useful anymore. And I hear a lot of conversations now about how do we begin to think differently about defense? How do we begin to prepare to defend Ukraine? How do we prepare to defend ourselves? And I think the message is getting through.
Isn't it a paradox that, on the one hand, Donald Trump did quite a few things that would please Vladimir Putin? On the other hand, he was one of the main sort of backers of this huge, I think you can call it a major rearmament program on the European continent. Isn't it paradoxical?
It's not, because Trump doesn't have a strategy, so he wouldn't have thought about that he's not thinking, I want Putin to win, nor is he thinking, I want Putin to lose. That's not really how he thinks. He thinks about himself. How will he come out of it? How can he be seen as the person who ends this war somehow? What Europe does with its defense is a separate issue.
Do you think that this idea of getting a Nobel Peace Prize is very important to him?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a factor.
No, I think it's real. I mean, his sons recently wrote something about it. I mean, they care. They imagine him as a great leader and peacemaker, and they don't have an idea of how to achieve peace, but yes, that's what they want.
Coming back to where we began, to the United States, if someone looks from the outside at the current state of affairs in the US, one sees, I'm not saying it is necessarily so, but one sees, on the one hand, the Republican Party, which is enthralled to the president, which is afraid to offend his popular base, if you wish. And then you have the Democratic Party, which does not seem to be able to produce any kind of visionary leaders that will appeal to wider swathes of the population. And you see only people with, well, you see them with left-wing views which will not be appealing to the majority of the Americans. What is going to happen next? Because we are always told by political scientists that American politics is so dynamic that everything turns essentially in a matter of 5 seconds.
That's true, although you're also making this mistake that almost every European I talk to makes, which is that you forget that America does not have a job for leader of the opposition. It's not a parliamentary system. There's no single person who's going to be the leader. And there won't be until we have primaries for the next presidential campaign, whenever it is, 2 or 3 years from now. So what you want is the emergence of some figure, but that's not going to happen. What you have instead is about 10 people, 10 to a dozen people, who are beginning to build really big constituencies. And the ones who get sometimes the most attention are the ones on the left, AOC, or the mayor of New York, by the way.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Right, yeah. Yes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or one of the candidates for mayor of New York, who, and by the way, mayor of New York has never been a position that leads into national politics, never. It just happens to be, a very loud election. But you're not seeing Chris Murphy, who's a senator from Connecticut, who's on air all the time, who speaks constantly, who's building a really important narrative about the excesses of billionaires and so on. You're not paying attention to Pete Buttigieg, who has an equally large online following. There's maybe, as I said, half a dozen senators and governors from different states who are also building support. Governor of Kentucky, governor of Illinois, governor of Pennsylvania.
We're all talking Democrats, right?
I'm talking, these are Democrats. These are Democrats. So, we had some weeks ago, we had the largest national demonstration. This was the No Kings demonstration. Against Donald Trump, which is the largest demonstration that there has ever been in American history, with the most numbers of people in all 50 states. So it's not quite fair to say that there's nothing happening.
And Republicans, are there people that you see now that are preparing to eventually challenge Donald Trump?
No, nobody will challenge Donald Trump before his term is over, but clearly there are people who will want to be president after him. And I imagine the main candidate right now is the vice president. There are 2 or 3 leading Republicans, a couple of senators who have made clear that they're going to begin to dissent more. One of them is the senator from North Carolina, Tom Tillis, who has announced that he's not going to run for office in 18 months, and instead he's going to spend the next 18 months saying what I think, which we assume to mean is being more critical. We have 2 or 3 others who have certainly at least made passage of legislation for Donald Trump very difficult. So we are beginning to see that too.
I spoke to one of the insiders in the Republican Party who said that in his view, and he's no Trump fan, in his view, very soon the American people, the American electorate, would like to see, and especially the Republican electorate, would like to see more calm style of leadership, more professionalism, more expertise, if you wish. Do you agree that this could be the demand soon, or maybe it's just wishful thinking?
I don't know. I mean, this was clearly why Joe Biden was elected in 2020, because people were sick of Donald Trump. And then they elected Donald Trump again in 2024. So predicting how the American electorate will feel in a year or two is not very useful. As I said, we are now at a moment when politics and voting is much less to do with policies. In other words, we used to have a competition between the center left and the center right in the United States about how high taxes are, or how big is the welfare state, or how much money we spend on the roads, or how much money we spend on healthcare. And those issues are now secondary to questions of which identity group do you belong to, and which candidates represent your definition of yourself. And that makes politics much more volatile and unpredictable, and it allows for the rise of candidates like Donald Trump, who don't really have policies, or who he has policies, I suppose. He has instincts rather than real policies, because that's not why people are voting. People are voting based on who makes them feel like a member of the winning group.
Last question. You describe in your book, Autocracy Incorporated, the rise of autocracies across the globe. And this is China, this is Iran, this is Putin. They're very different. Are they all enemies of the West, or some can be turned into temporary allies? And second question, what do you think should be the principles in this modern age of identity politics, of global information space and so on? What should the West do to be able to face this challenge and probably to win? This is a group of nations who, as you say, they don't have a common ideology. Communist China, nationalist Russia, and theocratic Iran are all very different. I don't think that as a group they necessarily all see themselves at war with the West or with the democratic world, although some of them do. But they do identify this language of Western democracy. So accountability, transparency, above all the rule of law, the idea of independent courts, the idea of free media. They identify those ideas as threatening to them and to their kind of power. And that's the thing that links, Bolivarian socialist Venezuela with communist China and the Iranian mullahs, is they all find this kind of language to be a threat to them, and they understand that they need to defeat it both at home and wherever else they can find it. They need to undermine it wherever it comes from. And that's the thing that they most have in common. I don't think it's personal towards any particular country or person, or maybe not as a group anyway. In my mind, to fight back against it, we need firstly to tackle some of the big weaknesses in our own society. I mean, we need to push back against this world of shell companies and tax havens, and we need to tax our wealthiest people the same way that other people are taxed. We need to eliminate this world of dark money, which both creates corruption but also funds the worst aspects of our political systems. We could, as a group of democratic nations, we could fight back against kleptocracy much more effectively than we could one-on-one. And we also need to look at regulating the internet. And by regulation, I do not mean censorship. I just mean making transparent the rules, thinking about what forms of social media we could have that aren't manipulated immediately by advertising companies, and giving people access to evidence-based conversation and better information. I mean, those are actually the sources of our own internal weakness, and defeating those or fixing those would go a long way towards helping solve the problem. Anne Applebaum, thank you very much.
Thank you.